distinguished guests, and dear participants. I would like to welcome you all to this special session 101, titled The Future of Global Publishing, Hegemonya, Ethics, and New Narratives. In half an hour time, we will be talking about the transformative dynamics shaping the publishing industry in the 21st century. I have the honor of being joined by Professor Salman Said, an esteemed scholar in social theory and decolonial thought. I will give brief information about him. Professor Said's research spans decolonial theory, post-structuralist political thought, and critical Muslim studies, with a particular focus on analyzing Islamophobia and racism. Professor is currently based at the University of Leeds, where he served as the head of the School of Sociology and Social Policy from 2017 to 2023. He has held academic positions in both UK and Australia and has been developing critical Muslim studies as a key area of research. Professor Said is also the founding editor of the academic journal Reorient and the author of influential books named A Fundamental Fear and Recalling the Caliphate. Also, besides these academic works, Professor Said regularly advises government, engages with international media, and participates in public discourse, contributing the global understanding of Islamism and identity. Today, he will share his perspectives on decolonizing publishing, the ethics of knowledge production, and Turkey's changing role in the global intellectual arena. Now, I would like to raise my first question about the publishing dominated by Eurocentric paradigms, especially with Western languages, particularly English. Dear Professor, how does the predominance of Western languages and publishing networks affect global knowledge production? What specific measures can we take to genuinely decolonize the bookshelf and ensure publishing becomes more inclusive of diverse viewpoints?
Thank you very much for that question. And the question actually illustrates the problem of dominance of Western languages as we are conducting this in English in Istanbul. So I think it's a good example of some of the issues that we face. I think there are two things I want to say about this, is that knowledge production cannot be separated from the question of the dominance of particular languages. As was said before, that one of the things about Western knowledge production has been the focus on monolingualism, the idea that only one language is a useful way of understanding society and producing knowledge. And monolingualism has a consequence and an effect on how we conceive of political communities. And as a consequence, monolingualism destroys the possibility of alternative ways of thinking, alternative ways of writing, alternative voices. Now, we kind of have a pattern that in the world right now, this pattern of having a dominant Western languages has had two main forces. So one you can see in many, many countries dominated by colonialism, from Britain or from France, the elite speak and intellectual work is done either in English or in French. What is interesting, of course, about Turkey is that it wasn't colonized from the outside. However, and one of the advantages is that it still had a thriving translation industry. That things that were occurring were being translated, and the act of translation is really, really important as a way of thinking about enhancing knowledge production, because translation means not just imitating, and as any translator knows, it actually is a creative act. You are bringing two different things together, and in that process, you're inventing something new. So I think part of this, the effort to decolonize must be a greater emphasis on translation, but understanding translation not simply as a linguistic exercise, but also as an intellectual exercise. And part of the translation is trying to work out how different groups of humans working in different languages and with different histories can learn from each other. And that, I think, is a really, really important way of decolonizing. And also coming to understanding that having one language is not normal. Most societies on the planet do not work with one language. Most African societies have multiple languages. So the idea that you have to have one language and then you build a state around one language leads to what I would call a methodological nationalism, which means you understand or try to build knowledge only on the basis of the nation state. And that, I think, is very difficult to do, and it is incapable of helping understand the problems of the world today, which are actually transnational. So if you want to take decolonization of the bookshelf seriously, I think we need to think about translation, not simply as language, but translation of knowledge, and to emphasize and support those efforts.
Thank you. The translation is our changing, shaping way of thinking intellectually. There is another matter, Professor, when we look into the relationship between publishing and politics in the Muslim world. From newspapers to academic journals, publishing has been a vital instrument in shaping political thought also. So according to you, from your perspective, how has the publishing industry influenced discussion on Islamism and modernity? What obstacles do Muslim intellectuals encounter when trying to assert their narratives within a globalized publishing framework?
I think one of the things is that you can't separate knowledge production from publication, because if you produce knowledge and you don't publish it or you don't transmit it, there's no point in producing knowledge in the sense that no one knows about it. So in a way, we have to see both knowledge production and knowledge publication as one thing. And immediately, that means that we are confronted with a publishing industry which is dominated by Western publishers, means that it's dominated by Eurocentrism, and when it comes to the matters to do with Islam, Muslimness, it's dominated by Orientalism. And that has practical implications. So if you want to write a story or any kind of study which challenges those views, it is far more difficult to get that published and for it to circulate. Because it doesn't circulate, it means that everyone thinks it's not actual knowledge. So the boundaries and frontiers of what can be said become narrower and narrower, and they're not normally the boundaries and frontiers of Muslim concerns. So you will often find the mythology of Orientalism being baked into Western publishing. And I want to make it clear that Orientalism isn't something that only non-Muslims do. Some of the greatest Orientalists and the greatest Islamophobes are Muslims, because they also internalize these things, and they also reproduce that in those industries. So I think it's important to see these issues as publication and production as being part of the way in which a culture excludes different kinds of voices. And one of the voices that excludes is the idea of a Muslim voice, that there can be a Muslim voice, and there can be Muslim concerns that are not identical to the concerns of secular societies. There may be overlaps, there may not be overlaps. So one of the issues is that a Western-dominated publication helps reproduce Orientalism and Eurocentrism, which we then internalize, and then we become also circuits of reproduction of Orientalism and Eurocentrism, much to the and that harms our ability to think about our problems and how to resolve them.
Okay. Then no discussion would be complete without tackling the ethical dilemmas faced by modern publishing. Publishers are increasingly challenged to balance between commercial interests and with ethical responsibilities. Based on your critical analysis of power structures and discourse, How can publishers and intellectuals ensure that truth and responsibility come over commercial pressures? How can academia contribute to promoting critical media literacy through ethical publishing practices?
I think this is a really, really important question, and the difficulty is this, that whenever you try and say that we want to be ethical, there are two ways to go. There's always someone who will say to you, well, you can be ethical or you can be profitable. So there's a kind of an argument between commercialization and being ethical. But the other argument is, well, how can we turn the ethical into commercial? And then you get this kind of superficial diversity and superficial kind of attempt to be ethical, which means that you make lots of loud noises, but you don't actually deal with the real fundamental problems and structures which underwrite a commercial logic which doesn't allow for those kinds of positions. So I think the first thing we have to think about is how is it that publishing industry in this day and age calculates the notion of what is commercial. Now, once upon a time, it was quite straightforward, and we had this idea that, well, you know what, ultimately, okay, the publishing is generally a commercial venture, and they will only publish what sells, and if it doesn't sell, it doesn't really have any value. Okay? However, some of the most important books in the world are not really belong to any particular publisher. The Bible or the Quran circulates up to this moment until Google claims that it's its own property. It belongs to everyone in a sense, and it circulates in different ways. And you can't argue that it's a commercial venture. But the argument about commercial ventures is what is commercially going to be successful also depends on who you think the audience is. This is why, for example, to give you an example from films, the rise of China as a geopolitical and geoeconomic power has meant that Hollywood has begun to change its films, so they often have a sympathetic Chinese character in the versions sold in the Chinese market. So you already have a translation of a recognition of different kinds of powers. So I think one of the most important things that we shouldn't think about the commercial as somehow a standard, but we should think about what makes something commercial. So the idea of ethics, there is no publisher that will say to you, not many publishers, that what I do is not ethical. And we know that there are international conventions which talk about ethical publishing, etc. But I think in this day and age, the thing that we are really confronting right now is the challenge of AI and the challenge of digitalization in relation to a fundamental issue. Everyone who uses any of the AI systems is basically using something which is parasitic, in a sense that it depends on things that have already been published or written or circulating before. So one of the things that we need to be thinking about is how do we protect creatives who actually are the ones producing the knowledge that needs to be published. And we've seen that there's a struggle that's going to happen now between whether we have strong or ways of having copyright regimes which protect creatives' production of knowledge. And I think if a new ethical publishing would need to find the right balance between distribution and protection of the creative effort that's required. Otherwise, you end up as another form of extractive industry where the creative work being produced in all kinds of places and many times in the global south simply is extracted without any resort or any kind of element to that. So I think that's an important element that we need to do there.
That's copyrights are the major to be protected in publishing sector as well as the Hollywood and the film sector. Okay, we carry on to the next theme. It's about Turkey, our country. We have reached intellectual heritage and unique geopolitical position. Presents huge potential to emerge as a global hub for publishing and knowledge production. As Turkey invests in media, publishing, and cultural diplomacy, it has changed to reclaim narratives and challenge prevailing global discourses. Professor Said, I would like to raise my last question to you. We would love to hear your thoughts about what obstacles and opportunities do you foresee for Turkey as it aims to become a global intellectual hub in the 21st century? And how can Turkey's publishing efforts offer an alternative to Western-dominated narratives in knowledge production?
I think it's really important that no country can be an intellectual hub without having a set of values, because intellectual production cannot be divorced from some sense of agenda or purpose. So I think that's a really important thing. Now, what happens in many countries of the global south, they often are asked to think about things like publishing or any creative industry, things like that, and simply think of it as a matter of hardware, that if we have the right resources, we have enough print, whatever, we will produce that knowledge. I think the point was made earlier that part of it must be what is going to be distinctive about the intellectual background that you want to be a hub for. And that, I think, is a crucial element. So in a way, the projects of intellectual work and intellectual creativity have to be aligned with particular kinds of transnational goals and values. If, for example, you want to think about, there's a space right now to talk about truth and justice, because we have seen after Gaza that the prior custodians of truth, like, for example, the various Western media outlets, have been found to be professional gaslighters. They have, it is very, very difficult for anyone to maintain anymore that they're simply exercising professional journalistic standards or professional publishing standards. When you look at how American universities, who again were supposed to be bastions of academic freedom, have responded to the protests against Gaza, against the violence and the genocide and the apartheid and the occupation, you have to think, well, who will now speak on the behalf of those who are being repressed, who are being occupied, who are being suffering? And we are so often, disgruntled Western liberals and their friends often talk about, we live in a post-truth world. And I think what they actually mean is they live in a world where their version of the truth is no longer understood to be true anymore, because it has become so exposed that no one takes it seriously. So in that sense, we have now a situation in the world right now that, is there a space for things that we value about human decency, human dignity? Are there these things that someone will be, is there a center where we can articulate them without constantly being undermined and subverted from doing so? So I think this is really the key factor here, that to become an intellectual hub, there is this kind of model that's simply becoming a franchise for the production of hardware, that you can move, for example, book production from one place to the other. But that's not the same as an intellectual hub. That's just a relocation of an industry. What you're really talking about is, if to be an intellectual hub, you have to have a thriving intellectual culture. You cannot have a thriving intellectual culture unless you are able to connect with wider global debates and concerns which are going on. And one of the main concerns right now is the idea of decolonization, which is also an idea about the recovery of lost ways of living, lost ways of thinking, lost writings, connecting them up. Those of you who haven't had the opportunity, I would recommend that you go to this exhibition, which looks at the printing in Turkey from the 18th century right to the modern, and see how quickly and how it actually, the changes that it brought in, and think about what that does to know that history. One of the arguments people make in the West is, why is it the Muslim world didn't develop? And the argument comes down to it, well, the Muslim world didn't develop because they didn't have printing press. And didn't have the printing press till the 18th century. Well, the thing is that no one ever asks, why is it they didn't want the printing press? Part of it was because they had a very strong calligraphic tradition. And that is a really valuable thing. It's not because they were stupid or illiterate or foolish, but for them, writing meant something else. Why must we think that writing can only mean one thing? And having a strong calligraphic tradition meant different ways that we think about books. It meant different things that what we wanted from publishing. Now, how many people know that story? So when you are confronted with why is it the printing press only arrived in the mid-18th century in the Ottoman state, you are either forced to say, oh, it was so terrible, if only the Ottomans had managed to bring it in the 15th century and everything would have been fine. And they did it because they were stupid, they were illiterate, etc. And we don't have the resources to contest that. Our education system doesn't teach us how to contest that. And it's not just the education at schools in different places, but it doesn't circulate. And this is what I mean by having a global intellectual culture in which these points are made again and again. This is what decolonization is. It's about recovering those moments together. So I would say to you that it's really about becoming a global hub. Requires not the focus on just the national space, because you're right. There is many advantages that Turkey has, many opportunities Turkey has to bring all of these things together. But what is really compelling is how those are used to tell a human story which is transnational, which is global, which encompasses all of humanity and speaks for human dignity when we live in a world where those who you thought they used to speak for human dignity have given up. And I know we're running out of time, so I will just close very quickly with one example. And this, we may say, has got nothing to do with publishing, but I would say to you it has. Because part of it is the idea of asserting narratives. If you look at the way that Europe is now treating, and the United States treating, the idea of refugees and migrants, which are the countries in the last 50 years which have had the largest number of refugees and migrants? There have been Turkey, Iran, Pakistan. There's been basically countries in the global south. And while it's not fun being a refugee anywhere in the world, but here is a place where at least there has been limits or contestation about the question of xenophobia. Now you're moving to a situation in Europe and the United States where you are going to have almost something like a soft apartheid, where citizenship is being taken away or will be taken away, and you have two-tier citizens. Now, in that context, when you have also what we've seen after Gaza about the limited ability to speak and ability to produce intellectual culture, I think this is an opportunity to speak broadly, to actually be bold and speak for human dignity, not just for Turkey, and think of a culture that speaks for those who no longer have a voice or have lost their voices.
Thank you. Huge efforts have been made to change the Western narratives about Gaza and migrants also. Thank you for your comment. We are running out of time for this session. I would like to thank Professor Sayed that he provided us with a clear understanding of the challenges and the hopeful strategies. Thank you for inclusive comments. And let me extend our heartfelt gratitude to you for your inspiring contributions to these crucial discussions. Thank you.
Thank you.